everyone is able to understand what's on the slide. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully we can get a thumbs up if, oh, come on, there we go. So can people see the slides? Yes.
Yep.
Yes, awesome. Thank you. So the first thing that I think it's important to do is to make sure that we are paying respect for a number of our communities that live in oppressed conditions within our society. So first, we'd like to offer a land acknowledgement, because even though we're in different places, it's important to be able to reflect on the ground on which we live, work, and dream, because this land is not our land. For more than 500 years, the First Nations have demonstrated resilience and resistance in the face of violent efforts to separate them from their land, their culture, and each other. But in spite of that, they remain at the forefront of movements to ensure that Mother Earth is cared for and that is able to continue to support life. Despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, it is and always will be their land. And so we need to educate ourselves about the colonialism and about our role in perpetuating oppression of the Native Nations peoples. Similarly, it's also very important to acknowledge labor. And so what we need to acknowledge is that much of what we know in this country today, including culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans, their ascendants and descendants who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking and of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. So we're indebted and need to acknowledge that debt for their labor and their sacrifice. And we acknowledge the tremors of violence that trickle throughout the generations and impact our African-American brothers and sisters, which are still visible today. Finally, as a result of COVID, we recognize that we need to also acknowledge the unnamed essential workers who labor for low wages and poor working conditions, but who maintain our economic, educational, and social systems as we know them. We thank them and advocate for equitable systems of pay, benefits, and appreciation for all those who serve in these essential positions, because it's very easy to forget. And in the time of holidays and the rush and crush of end of semester and stress of holidays, it's easy to forget these things. So the presenters, each one is going to introduce themselves, but I'm Colette Dollarhide. We have Erin Parsons-Christian, Sarah Shrewsbury Braxton, Emily Herman McMillan, and Monica Coleman. And each one of my colleagues, you can see our emails are right here. So if you would like to communicate with us after the fact, please feel free to email us. But we wanted to also have a moment just briefly to offer comments about our positionality that will inform the presentation. So Monica.
Thank you, Dr. Dollarhide. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. I would like to share some salient identities that shaped my worldview and identities that brought me into studying and using the social justice supervision model. So in terms of my identity, I identify as African-American cisgender female. I'm a mother of 3 African-American boys, and I'm a student. I'm an entrepreneur and a social justice advocate. So once I entered my program at the University of Mississippi, it was important for me to practice supervision that aligned with who I am and that centered the voices of my supervisees and their clients, but that also raised consciousness to help people understand, what oppression really looks like and how that impacts mental health, what privilege looks like as well. And so that is why I joined this team. That's why I do this work, and I'm grateful to be here.
Thank you, Monica. My name's Erin Parsons-Christian, and I am a third-year doctoral candidate at Ohio State, and I am a white cisgender female, and I'm also a mother of an 18-year-old son. And I have been a licensed professional counselor for 15 years. So prior to coming into the doctorate program, I did a lot of work with community-based family therapy with marginalized and minoritized families, a lot of youth that were at risk for incarceration or already linked with courts or children's services. And so my passion really started there when I saw all the gaps in what children aren't receiving and all the things that are going on that are barriers for them to be vulnerable to being incarcerated, the school to prison pipeline, and a lot of other things. And so when I came into the program, I was so fortunate to be able to work with Dr. Dollarhide, who, as we know, she's the leading scholar in this area. And this supervision model really shaped the dissertation work that I'm doing. So I've been fortunate enough as a graduate associateship to coordinate the practicum and internship program, where we've been able to use this model in training master's students with the work that they're doing. And it's just, I've been really honored to be able to be a part of that because I didn't get that exposure in my own graduate program many years ago. So I appreciate being here. Thanks.
Thanks, Erin. Hey, y'all. My name is Sarah Shrewsbury Braxton. I am a white woman. I am able-bodied, and I grew up in the South. So that's an identity that's recently become more important to me since I moved away from the South and I live in Ohio now. And also I have Appalachian roots. My dad was from West Virginia, so I've got a lot of family who lives there as well. While I was growing up, my family was pretty poor. So we started out in the low SES. And then as I got older, we moved into more of a middle class SES. So I definitely had some experience along that range. I'm a doc student now, so it feels like I'm back in the lower SES, but I don't know, maybe I'm doing better than I thought. Some other identities that are important to me is I'm a wife. I actually just got married over the summer, so I'm very excited to add that identity. I'm a friend, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm an auntie. I've got 7 nieces and nephews, so all of those things are really important to who I am as a person. I also have a school counseling background. So I was a school counselor in kind of around Nashville, Tennessee area for almost 10 years. And that really started my social justice work and my interest in social justice, because I had an experience in a rural school that a lot of students were like low SES and high brain reduced lunch rate. And then I had experience in a very affluent school district where it was the opposite of that, basically. So I saw directly the disparities between these two places and what resources, money, and opportunities can mean for students. I saw that directly. So when I came into this doc program, that's what I was interested in, and I've kind of continued that path. And a lot of my work focuses on social justice development, critical consciousness development, the culture of whiteness and how it impacts those things. And so that part of my identity has really developed over the past few years, and actually was able to implement the social justice supervision model, which we'll talk about later. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm super happy that all of you are here with us today.
Thanks, Sarah. I am Emily Herman McMillan. And it's funny because as we were preparing for this presentation and talking about what we were going to share in our positionality, I think it was part of like this like nourished joke of this idea of what if do I have to write down my identities, to not forget them. But now, like, listening to everyone share, it reminds me of how my identity as a white woman is this privileged identity that I don't have to think about often. And so I identify as a white, cisgender, able-bodied female. And I am a mother and a wife. And I have been a school counselor for over 10 years, and I had worked in predominantly rural and then other predominantly white schools. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago when I entered the doc program at OSU that I had my first opportunity to do supervision for school counselors. And my first supervisee was an African-American woman. And being in that supervisor role was already challenging because it was a new experience for me. But I also quickly recognized this layer of my lack of awareness of identities and where I was failing as a supervisor and not knowing how to best support a supervisee of color, someone who had different identities than myself. And that became really important to me over my time in the doc program. And since then, to learn more about myself, the identities that I hold and represent, the identities of others and how I interact with them, not only on a professional basis, but on a personal basis as well. Working as a counselor educator, the idea of how I can also help to share my identity and uplift and empower the identities of the students in the classroom. So that's really how I came to having a passion interest around social justice advocacy, but then specifically social justice advocacy for supervision. Dr. D, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm Colette Dollarhide, able-bodied, cisgendered, middle class. I hope I serve as a co-conspirator and co-disruptor. I recognize my journey has been longer than my colleagues because of generational things, but I'm also the grandmother of two biracial grandchildren who I adore. And it's not just for them, but it's also for our field that I recognize we have not been serving our students of color or students who identify from marginalized and historically minoritized communities. So it to me is critical that we have these conversations. So what we're doing today is deepening, what we hope is deepening the discourse around social justice within supervision. This model is unique because we hope that it will provide the opportunity for a different way of engaging our supervisees. So the session description basically is that we're going to go over the model super briefly. We're going to talk about a case study that we think will give an opportunity for all of us to kind of reflect on a variety of different identities and how they could impact this process. We were going to do demonstrations, but then realized that that would entail role-playing identities that we did not hold, and thought that that would not be the best way to try to highlight how this model might benefit the field or benefit you personally, and as you're considering your own social justice evolution. I'm going to go very, very briefly over this because the main point of this presentation is, again, to kind of see what it looks like in practice. So this, the self-evaluation is step one. And that is basically where the supervisor examines his, her, their identities, biases, assumptions, going deep. And really kind of taking a deep dive into who am I as a human being, who am I as a supervisor, and what are the systems that influence my worldview, and how do I make those systemic influences manifest? How do I examine and interrogate those? And then how do I understand those the way that they impact individuals that I interact with as a supervisor or as a clinician? But we're going to focus on supervisor in this conversation. The second step then is that the supervisor extends social justice in a systemic exploration with the supervisee Again, going deep, inviting the supervisee to bring all that they are, all that they will be into the supervision conversation, as well as role modeling, presence, sharing of power, and helping individuals to feel, who are in training, to feel that they are safe and in an environment where they are welcomed and valued. So that is step 2. In step 3, the supervisor is coaching the supervisee in his, her, or their social justice work with their clients, and directly encouraging the supervisee to bring social justice as a goal, not just a therapeutic goal, but also a social justice goal for every client in their practice, so that social justice then becomes infused throughout the therapeutic process and the supervision process. And then in the final step, together, the supervisee and the supervisor process, how did that feel? How did that look? How did it work? You know, what happened with your social justice goal? What happened with your therapeutic goal? So that it's not a matter of either or. It's not a matter of, oh, well, we're both white, so we don't need to worry about social justice. No, every client, every supervisee, no matter how much they look like us or may appear like us, like walk like us and talk, but it's not going to be the exact same. So we must explore all the identities and the intersectionality of all of those identities for every client, every supervisee. So then at the end, the supervisee and the supervisor work together to understand, how do we both improve? How does the supervisor improve the social justice supervision? And how does the supervisee improve their social justice work with every client that they meet? So that's an overview, very, very quick overview of the model. So are there any questions at this point? Is that too early to ask? That might be too early.
And you're welcome to unmute yourself or enter your question in the chat.
Thank you, Denise. Absolutely. Okay. I don't hear anything. Is there anything in the chat that we need to address?
Nope.
No? Okay. Okay, cool. So we are going to take a deep dive now in the model and the case study.
Thank you, Dr. D. And I think also, just as a reminder, we have done a North Central ACES webinar on the full description of the model that you can always go back and watch that recording. Although I do think Dr. D gave a great overview, and we're going to go through each one of those steps. Before I begin, though, I do want to kind of set an agenda, prepare you all of how we are going to proceed. So we're going to go through step 1 here, the self-evaluation, a little bit more in depth. We will then share with you the beginning of a case illustration of using the model. And I am going to read that case illustration to you. Each one of the co-presenters will read their section. And again, we are reading it for people who are visually impaired and struggling to, struggle to see some of that smaller print, for some of our auditory learners. So it's not that we don't think that you can't read it yourself. We just want to make sure that we are inclusive to all of the members in the audience today. And as we're reading through this case illustration, we want you to be thinking about the different pieces of the steps specifically that we have just covered. So when we read this case illustration in the next slide, I want you to be thinking about the self-evaluation component and all of these pieces. And then we're going to ask you to share and brainstorm some ideas of Gabriel, who is the supervisor in our case illustration, what he could be doing in his self-evaluation as he prepares to engage in social justice supervision with a supervisee who holds different identities than himself. So we'll give you the opportunity then to unmute yourself or put things in the chat. So we do want you to be thinking about how you can participate in these next couple of slides. And then we will finish up, section 1, step 1 with, hopefully a brainstormed ideas from participants, and then some of our feedback as well as things that we have done or see being effective in the self-evaluation. So again, this is where we decided to kind of modify the typical demonstration, so that way we were not representing identities that we do not hold and actually doing a demonstration in this session. I know that was kind of a lot, so if you have questions throughout this, please feel free to ask. I'm going to dive into step 1, though, the supervisor self-evaluation. And this is where I think a lot of our mindset and shift from, we have seasoned supervisors who've been doing supervision for maybe a discrimination model or some other type of model that they have centered their work in working with the supervisee around. And what's really great about this social justice supervision model is that you can use it in conjunction with whatever model you are already using. This is just an additional layer and piece to bring in the advocacy component for your clients, for your supervisee and for the clients that they are working with. So it doesn't mean that you have to change your entire routine or system of supervision. It's just, how do you go a little bit deeper on your own work that you may need to do as you go to out to work with supervisees and clients with different identities. And I mention this because I think we also recognize that a lot of our supervision models are really rooted in this positionality of power imbalance. So the idea of my supervisor, they're the ones who know everything, I'm just going to ask them, they know everything and what they need to do. It's this very, esoteric kind of model. And we're trying to break down those boundaries and break down those barriers by inviting our supervisee to really talk about the identities that they hold as well, and making it a space to do that where it may not have always felt that the supervisee, what were they bringing to the supervision model? They are bringing identities and thoughts and beliefs to the supervision session, and this is really encouraging you to allow that space to be a safe space for that. So I mention this because this is how we prepare for supervision. So thinking about what you're already doing when it comes to that structure and routine, and then how you want to shift some of those pieces to allow for examining, cultural bias, and the cultural components that you may have to engage in dialogue around when it comes to your supervisee working with clients. But we also recognize that before you even walk into that supervision session, you really need to take the time to continuously do your own self-assessment. So this might be something that you haven't done since grad school, or that you don't do on a routine basis. But I think that one of the things that can kind of be misleading about our graphic overall here is, step 1 being the self-evaluation, but it's also an iterative process. It's not like you do your self-evaluation and then you don't do it again. It's this consistent piece of, when you work with any new supervisee, checking your own bias that you may have. So that can be, potentially bias that you were aware of, but also that implicit bias that you hold in the different systems. So your core self, those immediate relationships, extended relationships, those kind of nested circles that we see in the model. And when we have that honest self-assessment with with ourselves, we can then kind of curate a learning, a study guide for ourselves of what that might look like to learn more about our own identity development, the identity development of, the supervisee that we're going to be working with, the client population that you might be working with, to have a better understanding of the identities of the people you're going to interact with. So I think that in this self-evaluation model, it's important to remember that this is how you are structuring your setting to make sure that, or your sessions, your supervision sessions to allow for this, but really doing your own work. And that's going to look obviously individual for everyone. Dr. D, if you want to click over there. So we're going to start then with our case scenario of Gabriel, and we'll be continuing to hear about Gabriel throughout the presentation. And this section, we are just focusing on his supervisor's self-evaluation. Gabriel is a 35-year-old Hispanic male who identifies as a member of the queer community. He has practiced as a licensed professional clinical counselor for 10 years in a community mental health agency serving an urban area. This setting has allowed Gabriel to work with various intersecting identities of clients. Individually, he predominantly works with adult male clients who identify as Black or Hispanic and have incomes near or below the poverty level. His first counseling supervisee is Lydia, a counselor trainee entering her internship experience. Lydia is a cisgender 23-year-old white female who is originally from a small rural town. She will work in the agency's youth and young adult program, focusing on prevention services, serving predominantly Black and brown students. In preparing for supervision with Lydia, Gabriel reflected on his role as a supervisor in a facility serving diverse clients with intersecting identities. Specifically, he started to consider his privileged and marginalized identities and considered his assumptions about young white females from rural backgrounds. What are the next steps according to step 1 in the supervisor self-evaluation that we think that Gabriel needs to take to really engage in the supervision, a social justice supervision model? So on the next slide here, we just want you to take some time to brainstorm. We have the graphic up here again of that self-evaluation piece to think about, kind of what we discussed entails in step 1. And we would invite you to either unmute yourself to share or add things in the chat.
We have in the chat from William, perhaps name his biases.
Thank you, William. Yes. So, and this can be creative as you want. So like when I hear you say, name your biases, is he keeping a reflective journal where he is, thinking about both, his explicit biases that he has awareness of, and, being able to visually see that? Is it important for Gabriel to actually look at those things and think about them? I also saw in here that Melissa put culturally broach with the supervisee. So I definitely think that that is a step within our model. My only caution is to think about this at this point of supervision. We haven't even really met with our supervisees. So be mindful of that this is work. So, he knows who his supervisee, and he may know, some of her identities that were listed in that case illustration, but he hasn't even engaged in conversation with her yet to be able to broach those, to broach the conversation. Monica put in a question there, curious about any other assessment. Thank you. Okay. So Monica, we are going to talk about assessments here using like the Kerwin Institute. So Monica, are you asking people to also share what assessments they may look at? Thank you. That would be great if people can share, like, what do you do to do your own self-assessment to be aware of your bias, both implicit or explicit? Melissa, usually don't get their identities until the first meeting or later. Understandable. I think every agency, every school is different. William sharing what biases might he have about what his new supervisee might have about him. So the idea of, William, I just want to make sure that I am understanding what bias. So what thoughts, reservations he may have about Lydia and what she thinks about him. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does that, oh, go ahead, William.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so you know, you have your own personal biases about what you might think about just an individual and their own identities, but then you might have your own personal biases of what you think they might be thinking about your own personal identities.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's again this like layered approach of I have my thoughts about this, but then I also think about what they think about this.
There's a social wheel, the social identity wheel that helps a person think about that, William. So I really appreciate you bringing it up.
Ashley shared he may need to reconcile differing power locations associated with racial and counseling experience identities. For example, he identifies as Hispanic, less power, while she identifies as white, more power. And he has more experience in counseling, more power, and she has less experience, less power. Ashley, I really appreciate you sharing that. When I first was reading it, like power locations, I'm like, I was thinking of physical locations, not their identity. So I really appreciate the example. Yeah, and recognizing where that we have multiple identities and that they are not always going to be more or less privileged than the people we are interacting with, whether that be clients or supervisees or supervisors in reverse. Anybody else have any other thoughts before we move on? I appreciate you all participating. So some of the additional ideas that we have talked about as a team working on the pilot study and just, you know, talking and creating the manuscript for the pilot study of how we worked through the self-evaluation piece was, you know, figuring out how we wanted to structure the supervision model and broach those topics of identity and social justice. So I think it was Melissa who said, you know, broaching it, we were trying to even just figure out what we wanted that to look like, how we wanted that to look in our very first session of broaching the power differentials. So even some of those pieces that Ashley mentioned in there, how because in right now talking about it, it can seem very easy to be like, oh, well, I'm just going to bring up the fact that I'm white and the fact that I'm the supervisor. But I think it actually takes a lot more awareness, insight to do that in a tactful way. So being able to purposely plan for it allows, and even like role play, there were times where we would meet together as a group and talk about how we would do this. So other supervisors would talk about in our supervision as supervisors is what we would call it, soup of soup, to, you know, discuss, like role play, like how do I bring up these issues? How do I broach these topics right from the beginning of supervision? So I think that was a key piece for us to be able to practice this with each other and really figure out how we wanted to do it in an intentional way. Another thing that we did was in our structure was, you know, we may set 2 or 3 goals with a client, or I'm sorry, with a supervisee, and we using this model decided that one of those goals was going to specifically be a social justice goal. So something specific. So that way your supervisee knew that this was going to be a focus of supervision when you met together and something that they were going to be actively engaged in as well to have discussion around. So that was part of the structure that we had created when we originally started this. So again, I don't think that this is the only way to structure or how you can approach things, but this is what we had initially brainstormed. We also thought it was important for Gabriel to explore the identity development models, especially like the Latino identity orientation, and the white racial identity development model. So again, exploring his own identities, as well as the, identities that he may not have as much awareness of, or have what he thinks is, from his own experiences, but actually getting to see some research around it may be beneficial to expand his ideas. You can also look at, because he identified with within the queer community, the identity orientation and development models for that community as well. And as I mentioned, we did do a supervision session where we would all be able to meet together. We selected different readings, all on our own. It wasn't like there was a list. I'm sure if we wanted to create a list, we can come up easily with one of the, but it was a list of things that pushed us to think about identities outside of our own and be able to have conversation around that regarding intersectionality and diversity. And then one of the tools that we used frequently in supervision and just in our program in general was the Kirwan Institute out of Ohio State University and their implicit bias modules. They are free. Anybody can use them. The link is there into the to take you directly to the page to help identify some of those biases that we are not even conscious of. So again, in this first step that you do continuously throughout the model is really about your own self-reflection and growing about what you consciously do, what you unconsciously do, and how that shows up in the supervision session, and then has this rippling effect to the supervisee and the clients that they serve from a social justice advocacy perspective. Before we move off of this, do we have any questions for step one? I saw that there was some stuff in the chat. So thank you to my co-presenters for sharing some of those resources. Appreciate you. And I will turn it over then to Sarah.
Thanks, Emily. All right, that was a great description of step one. We're going to move right into step two. So this is when the supervisor facilitates the supervisee's identity exploration. So Emily was talking about even pre-supervision. We're talking about, all right, maybe we've just met, maybe we've had a couple of sessions. How are we going to explore both of our identity constructs and how those meet up in supervision? And it's also important to highlight how those constructs show up in all systems. And I can use myself for an example. So I am a white woman. In the counseling field, those are both dominant and privileged identities because the majority of counselors are white women. However, when we think about in the larger world, being white is a privileged identity, but sometimes being a woman may be a marginalized identity, depending on the system that I'm in. It just sort of depends on where I'm at. So that's just an example of what I mean by all systems. And we're also looking for strengths that focus on cultural capital. So I don't know if you are familiar with Yasso's work. Such a great article if you get a chance to ever read that. But Yasso highlights the different types of capital that we often overlook with our supervisees, with our students, with our clients. Often we are looking at people who have been marginalized through a deficit-based lens. So we consider the identities that they hold as a deficit or as not an asset, when really Yasso said, we need to flip that. Let's think about the capital that they hold based on those identities that they have, and really lift that up. And those are the different types there. What we've seen is that a lot, I'm coming from a school counseling background, so you might hear me refer to students a lot, but also you can imagine your clients as I'm talking about this. But especially with our students where English is a second language, they have linguistic capital. They can speak 2 or more languages. And yet in schools, we often look at that as a deficit, which is wild to me. A lot of our populations and our students and our supervisees who have been marginalized, they have resistance capital because they have been forced to have resistance capital. They've been forced in situations where they have to resist and they have to be resilient. So those are just a few examples there. We can also get into some identity development models here in this stage. And I will say just personally, and Emily had this listed on her last slide, Janet Helm's white racial identity model was very helpful for me in my own identity development. So if that is an identity you hold, you might look that up and maybe gauge which stage you think you're in and what you might need to do to grow in those stages. It's important to think about the self-definition of your supervisee, letting them define those identities for themselves, their voice and power, and the cultural healing traditions that they bring to the table, because that's different for everybody. To think about their values, to think about the cultural biases that maybe you hold, that maybe your supervisee holds, and thinking about discourse analysis and deconstructing those things. So, super easy. I'm sure that y'all can just manage that in a couple sessions. But let's go ahead and look at our case study, and we're going to flesh out some things between Gabriel and Lydia, and I'm also going to read mine to you. So if you want to follow along, let's do that. So Gabriel and Lydia begin working together in supervision. Lydia shares with Gabriel that she is really excited to work with clients, especially as she explains poor minority clients because they need the most help. Gabriel appreciates Lydia's enthusiasm, but is also concerned about how she is conceptualizing the students and clients she's working with. During their second supervision session, he encourages Lydia to reflect on her own identities. Lydia struggles to describe her cultural identity because she and her family were just normal people, like she says. She explains that she understands that she is a white woman with some privilege, but she also isn't as privileged as other people because she grew up in a working class in a rural community where she and her family face many challenges. She has a lot of pride in her family because they worked very hard to help her get where she is today. Her dad worked 2 jobs and her mom babysat for other people so that they could help her financially in her undergraduate and graduate programs. Lydia tells Gabriel that just like her parents, everyone has the chance to work hard and change their circumstances. Some people just choose not to do it. And some of the things that Lydia says are personally frustrating for Gabriel, but he also understands that Lydia could benefit from further identity exploration. So Gabriel seeing some problematic things that Lydia is saying, but also understands that he's a supervisor and has to help her navigate these situations, even though they are personally frustrating to him in a lot of ways. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you want to unmute, let me know, put it in the chat. What are some things that Gabriel could do to kind of spark that identity exploration and have these discussions with Lydia? And if you want to use examples from your own work or anything you've done, I would love to hear about that.
I don't see anything in the chat so far. I don't know if you wanted to give it another moment or two.
Yeah, I'll let people think on that. I love that Ashley suggested providing resources on things like meritocracy myths. Love that, because I think that is certainly a trend in our country to think about the American dream. And if you work hard, you'll succeed. But we know that it's not true for many people, especially people who have been marginalized in our society. So thanks for sharing that, Ashley. So maybe even in supervision, Gabriel can point out a meritocracy myth and challenge Lydia with that a bit. So love that. Any other thoughts on this one? Thank you, Monica, for that. So yes, Melissa talked about broaching identities. I think this would be a great spot to do that. So it would be good for Gabriel to point out, hey, this is where we're different. These are some of my identities that he feels comfortable sharing, and that he would ask her to share at this point as well. So broaching could definitely happen at this point and would probably need to extensively, it sounds like, since we've got a lot of different identities from both folks. Yes, and I'm really glad Ashley picked up on this. This is what I was hoping for. Asking Lydia to think about what her white culture entails. She also has a culture that's not just normal. Now I have taught undergraduate students and master students, and in our multicultural class that I taught, I asked students to bring in a food that represents their culture. And the majority of my class were white women, like we've already talked about, since that's the majority of our field, and they really struggled to do this. They really struggled to identify a culture because in their minds, whiteness had been so normalized and become so standard that that was just normal and regular. It didn't even, they didn't even think of it as a culture. So we had to get into, what does being white entail? What does whiteness entail? So I think maybe pushing Lydia on this a little bit, or challenging Lydia on this a little bit, could be helpful too. We all have a culture, whether we can recognize it or not. So I love those thoughts. If you continue to think of a few things you've done, feel free to throw those in the chat. I'm just going to give you some ideas. These are some things I've done in supervision, I've done in class, that I'd love to share with you. So this first one is a link to a values clarification worksheet. I kind of feel like if you start with values and what a person values, you can really work your way out to incorporating identity and then professional identity as well. So that worksheet could help you clarify what Lydia's values are, what she holds important. And then if she's bringing up something counter to those values in a supervision session, you can circle back to it and talk about it. I love a Starburst identity chart. This is similar to what Monica suggested earlier, the social identity wheel, which I'm so glad she did. That was the first time I'd seen it, which is awesome. But this Starburst identity chart is something, again, it was actually, I found it in a lesson for middle schoolers, but I have done it with undergrad students, master students, and in presentations as well. And people do really well with this. And it, I think, is an activity that sparks the thoughts that you're hoping to get in supervision. So really simple, you draw a circle, that circle represents you or the supervisee, you have them do this. And then all the arrows that go out is particularly how other people might identify you, and the arrows that go in are how you might identify yourself. This can provide really rich conversations in supervision, and you can start to know how those things look different. Sometimes what I have students do is have them fill this out and then introduce themselves to each other based on their identity chart with whatever they feel comfortable sharing. So that could also be something that Gabriel asked Lydia to do. If he's looking to spark these conversations, this could be a good starting point. I also think that groups of friends activity and reflection is really helpful. So you'll see a little screenshot down here of that. You have folks list out 5 friends. It says 10, but I would really struggle to list 10 friends. I don't know if y'all would, but you can start with 5. And then there's these identity constructs listed next to them. So by every friend's name, you put an S if their identity is the same as yours, or a D to see if their identity is different than yours. So what I often find when I do this with students, I have them add up all their S's and all their D's. And typically they have a lot more S's than they do D's. I mean, we tend to surround ourselves with people who look and think like us, right? So having Lydia do this could help her start to see, oh, like I have surrounded myself with folks who are very similar to me, but now I'm working with people who are very different than me. And I think it really spurs conversations about, what does it mean if you're not getting different perspectives in your life? What does that look like? Why is that important? Why would that matter? So I found that to be a good teaching tool as well. I also think it's really helpful just to have supervisees, and because this works for me, but to select readings, shows, movies, podcasts, books. Like there's so much media in the world that center people who have different identities. I mean, you can log on to Netflix and find a ton of shows that highlight folks with different identities. Now you have to make the choice to watch them and to see what that looks like. But I found that provides really good discussions in supervision. Oh, have you watched that? What did you think about it? What stood out to you? What was surprising to you? Like those kinds of things. And then I'm assuming you're probably all familiar with the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. That could be another tool you use with a supervisee, is actually going through that. They give you a nice little chart. Looks actually pretty similar to, I mean, it's a circle. That's what I mean when I say similar to our social justice supervision model, and it has layers to it as well. So you could certainly work through that together in supervision. And then Emily mentioned this before, but creating a social justice or advocacy goal. This is something that Emily and I both did with our supervisees when we were implementing this model. And I found it really helpful because it put words to what we were trying to do. It quantified it in some ways. Now I was really flexible with the goal and how we quantified it, but I found it to be really helpful. And I hope Emily did as well. Yes, and thank you, Lisa, for putting this in the chat. I think this is a really important point. So Lisa's talked about being a white doc student, new supervisor, and that these supervisee conversations are difficult. Absolutely agree. That is the whole reason I think that we're trying to implement this model, because we want to give you some strategies for how to do this. It is putting a lot of the emotional labor on Gabriel. So, and I think one of the second parts to my question that I asked on the previous slide, which, and I'm not sure that I actually said it, so I'm glad that you noted this in the chat, is how can Gabriel facilitate her growth while still protecting his mental health and his peace? Because it is not Gabriel's whole life to make sure that Lydia gets this stuff. Lydia is going to have to do a lot of stuff on her own to make this work. So excellent point. I think my hope was that if I gave you some concrete strategies, here's a worksheet you can use, here's a chart you can use, here's this strategy to use, that will lighten some of that emotional burden that a lot of times we feel when we have these conversations. So I appreciate you letting us know what you're thinking about that, also so I could highlight this too. All right, so I hope this was helpful to you. I hope you've gotten some good ideas, and I think it's time to move on to step 3.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so excited to talk to you guys about this stage. I love the whole model, but this is one of my favorite pieces of the model because modeling and coaching social justice is so important. And, you know, everything that's been talked about today is really building to this point. And so we as supervisors, we have to make sure that we're prepared to model social justice work in the relationship with our supervisees. So, you know, broaching is a technique that we can use at all stages of supervision. We just have to be intentional about how we use it. So, you know, for instance, how can I show up as a supervisor and model my journey, right? So the supervisor being willing to be vulnerable and share how they pitfalls that they've had, you know, things that they've run into when they were just starting out on their journey, so that they can create safety for the supervisee. So, you know, using process of illumination to show supervisees, what does it feel like? So in the real time. So what is that? So examining themselves in the here and now and studying transactions that are happening both between the supervisor and supervisee and with themselves. So as a supervisor, we have to have our own I call it self-supervision process. And I learned that in my family therapy training. So for instance, we always bring our own personal and professional identities into the room, right? They're never not here. And so when I work with supervisees, I talk to them about how our stuff is always always in the room. And the goal, one of the goals is to make sure that it stays up in this corner. And we have to know when our stuff's coming into the process and to be able to self-supervise that. And if it does, to be honest and open and transparent. And so by doing that, we're showing and we're teaching, collaborating, supporting in an experiential way for the supervisee what kind of relationship we want to have with them and how we want to support them in that process. And we're also showing them how can they take that work and do that work with their clients, right? So how can they, use culturally affirming interventions for clients and for supervisees? So inviting the supervisee to extend social justice into every single work that they do, every single case, every single session. I want to give an example to this before I jump into the scenario. Doing community-based work is one of the most meaningful experiences I've had. And when I was working with families in the community, I had to know their community. I had to build multiple therapeutic alliances. I had to work with probation officers and caseworkers, and I had to know where the food banks were. And that's a huge part of that, right? It's so much bigger than the clinical piece. So we have to really know how to work in systems and to be able to be advocates in all different ways, not just in the supervision sessions and not just in the counseling sessions. So the last, but certainly not least, part of this is discourse analysis and power analysis. And my colleagues shared this, in different ways. We have to know how power dynamics show up in the room. And I can't put the onus on the supervisee to broach that. I have to be ready to come in and talk about power and how power exists in different relationships, and to really make sure that I'm languaging things in a way that feels collaborative and that there is an equal equality within the relationship, right? That I'm not over the supervisee. And helping them transfer that into the work that they do with their clients. So with that, we'll jump in and look at the scenario and kind of bring this to life. All right, so with step 3, we're going to look at modeling and coaching social justice. So Gabriel is meeting with Lydia today for their weekly supervision session. Lydia struggles with building rapport and creating strong therapeutic alliances with the clients and families she serves. While Lydia appears to be open and self-reflexive about her personal and professional growth, Gabriel recognizes the importance of modeling cultural humility and using broaching interventions to assist Lydia in self-actualizing in her ability to practice social justice counseling in ways that will be most beneficial to her and her clients. Gabriel discloses his experiences with personal and professional cultural and racial identity development. He goes on to share how his intersecting identities impact his professional roles and how he has used understanding his strengths, weaknesses, and barriers faced with previous clients as opportunities for growth. Broaching techniques are used to facilitate Lydia's ability to be self-reflexive about what she can do to enhance her work as a practitioner. This is accomplished by using psychoeducation to increase Lydia's understanding of how the phenomena of unconscious bias, blind spots, and white gaze can impact the social justice identity growth. Gabriel validates where Lydia is at and commends her for being willing to do this difficult work. He motivates Lydia to reflect on what she learned about herself and others after completing the Starburst assignment. Did this activity help Lydia gain insights into how her multiple identities and positionality inform her lens and how she conceptualizes her clients and the work they are doing together? Lydia is challenged to process how she can work with clients to discuss their cultural identities and identity development collaboratively. How will Lydia use broaching to process assumptions she and her clients have about the cultures and identities, about other cultures and identities? Furthermore, Gabriel suggests Lydia begin thinking about how she will model cultural humility and transparency when doing social justice work with her clients. So, given where we're at with this case scenario, what are your thoughts on what you would do here at this stage as the supervisor to support Lydia in the work that she's doing with her clients? And I want to say something because I know it's a little bit different doing something like this on Zoom than it is in the room. Usually when I'm in the room, I'm standing up, I'm walking around, I'm able to engage with you guys. We don't expect you to have the right answers here. We just want to hear, what are your thoughts? What would you do? What have you done? How is your experience as a supervisor or as a supervisee? How has that shaped your thoughts here and what you would do? And feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat. Any questions? Anything that's confusing about this stage that you say, you know, I kind of want to know a little bit more about this? Okay, so Justin, thank you. Justin says, like Gabriel, I find just acknowledging our own identity awareness journey opens the door for supervisees to start using that language and speaking about their identities. Yeah, hopefully this will trickle into their sessions as well. I know I learned how to talk about the identity from wise supervisors myself. Excellent point, Justin. Yeah, we have to be willing to discuss our identities, right? And so, you know, for me as a white woman, how do I need to show up and talk about my own cultural biases, my own blind spots? You know, how can Gabriel transcend that work to be able to really make her feel comfortable to open up? Okay, yeah, Kelsey, we're looking at the teach section. So, and I want to say this too, when we look at teach, you know, we can teach this, but our supervisees teach us a lot too, right? So it's not just about what they can learn from us. And that's another key piece to this. We do need to talk about the importance of being collaborative here, right? The importance of really, you know, helping support the supervisee if they're having barriers, if Lydia's having a hard time with building that multiple therapeutic alliance. So someone earlier in the chat put that it's difficult to broach these topics, right? So I have to understand what my own racial identity and cultural identity development and journey has been. Because if I don't understand that, how am I going to be able to support supervisees through that process? So is there any other ideas on what you would do? Okay, well, we'll move on to some adding things that we can look at. So I love some of the suggestions here because they really helped grow my identity as a supervisee and as a person working with families as well. So we need to consider taking a deep dive into cultural competency theories and models. And today we talked a lot about the social justice supervision model, but we also want to look at critical race theory. We have to understand what it is. We have to look at how critical race theory, Black feminist theory, how do those build and work with intersectionality? So it's really, really important that we understand intersectionality and how our intersecting identities impact the work that we do. And one of the key models here that's really important to understand is the voluntary and involuntary minorities model, because we have to understand that there is a difference in how minoritized people experience their world and how they experience the United States, depending on if they were born here and raised here or if they came here, right? There's people that have come to this country and they're excited to be here and they want the opportunities. And they might face discrimination in different ways, but there's also people that were born here and have minoritized identities, and they have a lot of ambivalence and negativity about what they've experienced growing up, right? So we can't treat everyone the same, right? So if I'm working with multiple people, someone said it earlier that look like they have the same racial identity or gender identity, it doesn't mean that they have the same experiences. So really important for us to understand the complexities of racial identity development. I think that this should be something that's part of training that we do in graduate school, and I'm excited that our program's been doing that. So really understanding Helm's racial identity development model, as well as the complexities of this. It's just as important for me to understand other racial identity models as it is for me to understand my own. Because if I don't understand other racial identity models, how do I know where someone might be? And how do I know where I need to support them? A key thing too is understanding, how do you show up into spaces? How does my race affect someone else's experience in the space? Can I be triggering as a white female to someone? And so these are really important things to understand and to think about when you're doing this work. Implicit association test is a really salient thing to do, because we have to understand what our implicit biases are. And if we don't understand those, we're not going to be able to be informed. And so doing implicit association tests really increase our multicultural competency as supervisors and as therapists. And then the last but not least, evaluating white privilege activity. This is an article. It's one of my favorite articles that Dr. McIntosh did. And within it, there's 26 questions that she asks people who have privileged identities to ask themselves. And when they answer those questions, it really becomes clear, and it should become clear, how different it is to walk around as a white person with a privileged identity versus a person of color. Do I have to think about, Emily mentioned, do I have to think about my identities as a white woman, right? So we really need to pay attention to that. So with that, I will shift it over to Monica.
Thank you, Erin. So now we're at stage 4 here, which is really, the way I think about this stage is we've looked at ourselves, we've worked with our supervisee to look at themselves, and we've talked about how our identities relate or don't relate, and learned about social justice together. And now we're going to self-reflect and process on what that looks like, what that's produced. So in this stage, we're thinking about 2 goals. So not just the clinical piece, but also the social justice goal. In our reflection and processing, both the supervisor and the supervisee should be learning because we've done this journey together. And so we both reflect out. And it's important to try to maintain the positive energy of social justice so that when we do this reflection, it transfers into motivation to do more social justice work and future social justice reflection and improvement around anti-racist and anti-oppressive work across all systems. So when you think about the model and you think about all the work that we've done, this stage will happen sometime later than, when we first started, because we would have needed to have accomplished some social justice work, some progress towards our goals. And we're basically assessing at this point through self-reflection. So let's look at our case scenario here. So Lydia felt something changed about how she viewed clients after her first 3 months in supervision. She shared that her notes began to look more into the social and environmental factors that impacted her clients. Her clients seemed to connect better with her when she asked about these factors and their impact. One client even asked Lydia to accompany them to the principal's office to ask for additional time on a test. Lydia supported the student. The student was not able to get more time, but reported feeling less stressful during the test after advocating with Lydia. Gabrielle pointed out to Lydia that she had practiced social justice in that situation. He asked her if she had noticed the exact things she did to promote clinical and social justice outcomes for her clients. He further asked her why she thought these actions were important and how they translated into impact for the client. Lydia processed her thoughts and committed to continuing advocacy work. So let's talk about this ideal of processing. How do you process with your clients? And are there things or questions you would ask that may look different if you're processing for social justice supervision than what you already do with your supervisees? feel free to unmute yourself or join the chat. And thank you, Justin. I see that mutual growth stood out to you. Definitely, there's some sort of similarities, right, in the relational cultural theory and this model for sure. And as we mentioned earlier, this model doesn't have to be separate from another. So you can definitely merge the two or work with the two to achieve this goal. But we definitely focus on that mutual growth and mutual sharing throughout the entire model. So what type of things would you do to help Lydia, if you were her supervisor, what type of things can Gabriel rather do to help Lydia process the work that she had done to help her clients achieve their clinical and social justice goals? So while you're thinking, I will share that this semester I supervised 2 students at my institution using this model from beginning of the semester to the end, was just finished. And this week we were doing this stage at the very end here, because there's such a short time that you have in a semester. But one of my supervisors said something that really was interesting to me. By the way, I think I mentioned to you that I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Mississippi, which is a predominantly white institution. Most of our students are, as Sarah said, white females. And of course, I'm an African-American woman. And so a part of why I wanted to use this model was because I knew there would be some, privilege and oppression and power things happening in my supervisee relationships. Both of my supervisees this semester were white women. And one of them shared with me in her reflection that at the beginning of the semester, when I explained to her that I would be using social justice supervision, it scared her. She actually became afraid. And by the end, she was saying, oh, this is just making me think about the whole situation that my clients are in and making me more aware of my own biases. So I felt like, wow, okay, maybe I did something right here. Because she was no longer scared. She's interested in continuing to do social justice counseling. And so that was interesting to me. And I just want to share that. Sarah, thank you for your comment. I see you're saying sometimes supervisees don't always know how to name things as social justice. So even just highlighting that what she did was advocacy or social justice work can be helpful. Absolutely. Ashley, thank you. Ashley says that, okay, so this is a recommendation for Gabriel. So Gabriel can help Lydia reflect on how she was able to disrupt the system even through small interventions in her immediate circle. That's wonderful. And, that creates positive energy when you can help people see that they are doing social justice work and they're not just learning about it or talking about it, because social justice work is action. So I definitely think that this point is a good one that you're sharing, Ashley. Kelsey, thank you for your comment. So Kelsey says that she's seen several supervisors say they're scared of social justice work and counseling, and she resonates with that, with what I shared about that. Thank you for sharing that, Kelsey. And I don't know what that fear is, but we definitely hope that through this model, we can reduce some of that. We can eliminate some of that in our field, because the staged approach and the sharing approach that the supervisor does in this throughout this model, we think can just help our supervisees sort of lower their wall or that fear that they have with sharing about their identities and their biases, so that they can have better outcomes for their clients. We know that what happens in the supervisee relationship is a model for what could be happening in the supervisee's relationship with their clients. And so by us modeling that broaching, we do feel that this can then transfer into the counselor-client relationship. Justin, I see your comment here, suggesting that we work with Lydia to see how she can continue to cultivate a social justice mentality with her clients. So what are the next steps in deepening that awareness and owning that role as an advocate? I love this. So it's a continuous process, right? So we're not ending at this stage, but this is a stage, but we continue to do this work. There's no end to this work, right? And so how do we go deeper? How do we grow in our own awareness and in transferring what we do into the mentality of our clients? That's definitely one of the outcomes that we want to see. William, I see your suggestion to ask the supervisor to reflect upon the supervision process and what insights they have gained through the process. That's wonderful. That's exactly what I did in my own work, and definitely what in our scenario here, Gabriel was doing as well. Justin, for better or for worse, social justice is a loaded term, especially for master's students who have not had to tackle these kinds of topics before, but they have seen some of the political rhetoric, and they are sometimes afraid to make a mistake. I really appreciate this comment. I think it's so true. And I think that really justifies the work that we're putting into making this model, increasing awareness around the model, studying the model, things of that nature, because we don't want social justice to be this sort of, pie in the sky or thing that we say because it's a sexy topic. We want it to be something real that actually helps our clients liberate and become more healthy in their mental health and wellness. Ashley says, I think the fear of social justice can be the enormity. Oh, wait, I just noticed there's a lot of comments in here. So for the sake of time, I will respond in the chat. But thank you all for sharing with me. I want to point out some additional ideas here. So for focusing, remember the main piece in the processing is to make sure you're focusing on both the clinical outcomes and the social justice outcomes. So when you think about the clinical outcomes, some of the things we should be thinking about as supervisors is exploring that the non-traditional healing practices, okay, discussed in the client-counselor relationship. So there may be things that are promoting healing for your clients that are not necessarily in our traditional approaches, but we should support that in our clients. We should, in our supervisees, as they talk about that as a outcome for their clients, we need to point those things out and we need to uplift those things, because one of the things in this model that we're looking at is how do we go beyond those traditional practices to go to what really works for the clients. And so we think that this model helps facilitate that. We also should think about data that centers the client's desired outcome. So when you're talking to your supervisor, asking them, what evidence are you using as you think about the treatment plan and advancing the client goals? What evidence, what data are you using to help them achieve their outcomes? And consistently seek the definition. I think Erin and Emily both spoke to this, but seeking the definition and perspective of the clients in regards to what success looks like. So again, moving from, what we think to what the supervisor, teaching the supervisor that what the client thinks is most successful. And we practice that also with the supervisee. So we ask the supervisee themselves about what's been successful for them, and that models into the client-counselor relationship. And finally, on the social justice outcome, just exploring what's possible in the various levels and systems, discussion the connection between social justice work within the supervisee relationship and how it transfers or influence, or that sort of that contagion between the counselor and the client as well. So thank you all for these comments. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Dollarhide, who will talk about our pilot study.
So thank you so much, Monica. And thank you, Sarah, Erin, Emily, Monica, all of you. Just wonderful presentations. Thank you. I want to make sure we have a few moments for questions. So I'm just going to show briefly. We did a very, very initial pilot study with a number of the supervisors who adopted it. And we did find that the model increased the social justice focus of the work that they were doing. I'm going to go super fast like this. The second finding is that the identities of the supervisor, supervisee, and clients did have an impact on the implementation of the model, so that supervisors reported a better integration of social justice in all of their work and professional identities, and that they were able to use client identities in order to increase the social justice actions within supervision, using the identities of the client to justify and to encourage the supervisee to get involved with social justice work. The use of the model, it did impact the social justice work of the supervisor in that they felt that they grew in terms of their own social justice identity. There were some challenges that it certainly was a part of some of the experiences that the initial adopters of the model did find, it was a challenge because not all the supervisees were in the same stage of readiness to engage in social justice work. So they kind of bumped them along a little bit. And that because this initial rollout, the article was published in 21, January of 21. And so the initial core of folks that were practicing the model were dealing with COVID, dealing with the election of 2020, and dealing with the increased awareness of Black Lives Matter movement because of the very public murders of Black men and women during the summer of 2020, which we know has not stopped, nor has it been an isolated event in 2020. It was just on TV. And now white America does have a greater awareness, whether or not they're acting on it. So the supervisors who were in this initial study had definitely found that there were direct impacts from some of those events on the work that they were doing. So too fast, I know. What questions, I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to try to stop sharing. There we go. Now I can stop sharing. What questions do you have? I know we're close to running out of time, but are there additional questions that we can address?
I had a question.
Yes, please.
I think that this is a great webinar, and I'm really interested in implementing this with supervisees. My question is how do you suggest implementing it with supervisees? You had mentioned that are new to these concepts and may be resistant. I find that I run very close to running out of time, especially focusing on their clinical work. So how do you balance that personal and how they are with their clients and also the clinical work within 1 hour a week?
I will let my colleagues answer that, but that was one of the universal experiences that they all had, was that it's more time consuming. So Monica, Erin, Sarah, or oh boy, Emily, do any of you want to address this question?
I think that for me, that was where that structure piece became really important for me to identify how I wanted the session to go. And when I initially met with clients, or with supervisees, I should say, I would tell them, like, here's how I envision this looking for us. Like, I come from my supervision style. I use this social justice supervision model, which is going to require us to talk about a social justice supervision goal when we get together, and then outline the other, like, clinical goals that we are having. So that way they knew intentionally that we needed space for all of these things. And then as they became comfortable with that setup, it would sometimes then allow for more flexibility in the idea of, they would ask, like, can we start with, like, our social justice goal this session, so that way we can have more time for it. I don't have as much with my clinical. And I think the more comfortable, where they're at in their own identity development, where they're at in their development as a counselor, it's going to be completely different from a practicum student versus an internship student versus a new professional, that you know, maybe can start to focus a little bit less time on those clinical skills that they've been building and more time on that social justice skills, the further along or the more that where they're at in their own identity development of those things. So that was what was helpful for me, is like I had my own initial structure, so they knew where I was coming from and how this was being set up, but also able to modify where they were at too.
Did you have anything to add, Monica?
The only thing I would add is my approach to supervision, and the two goals were that I really didn't separate them at all. And so there's a book by Ratz and Peterson, I think 2014, that talks about social justice counseling. And so at the initial assessment, you're working with the client to see what level of intervention is needed, whether it's in the individual or at a meso or micro level or macro level. And so for me, in the initial intake, I sort of decide with the client right then where their primary intervention needs to be. And then that guides the goals and the setting and how I structure each session with the supervisor, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I know that we've come to the end of our time. We really, really appreciate all of you who hung in there. Dr. Ford, I see you. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who participated today, and feel free to email us if you have additional questions.
Yeah, thank you so
Huge-
much.
Yeah, a huge thank you to all of our presenters and to everyone who came. Thank you, presenters, for your wonderful expertise and experience to share with us. One quick reminder about CE credits: you will receive a short survey by email to the email that you registered for the webinar with. Once you complete that survey, you should get your CE certificate within a week to 2 weeks. Please feel free to reach out to NCACES if you need anything. The PowerPoint slides should come to you all by email from the webinar committee. And again, just a huge thank you to our presenters for being with us today.
Thank you. This has really been a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you.
Everyone have a great rest of your day and weekend.
Take care,
Happy
everyone.
holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.